These lectures are part of the Great Courses series. They are produced by the Teaching Company. These lectures are titled Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition, Part 2, Literature of the Classical World. Lecture 13, Herodotus.
Hello, and welcome to Lecture 13, in which we're going to continue our consideration of the cultural environment of 5th century Athens by turning to the first great prose narrative in Western literature, the histories of Herodotus. The works we've been looking at before this point have all been in poetry. The Homeric epics, Greek tragedy, lyric poets, all of those are written in verse. With Herodotus, we turn to the development of prose in the Western narrative tradition. Herodotus is often referred to as the father of history because he was the first Greek writer to take events of the recent human past as his primary subject and, very importantly, to try to explain the causes of those events. And so that makes him, in many people's estimation, the first true historian in the Western narrative or literary tradition. Herodotus was born in Caria, which is in modern-day Turkey, on the western coast of modern-day Turkey. He was born in Halikarnassus, a town that today is called Bodrum, but though he was born in what we would call Turkey, he was ethnically Greek, Greek-speaking. This was an area that was under Persian domination at the time of his birth, but that was Greek culturally, ethnically, religiously, and linguistically. Ancient tradition tells us that Herodotus was born in 484 BC, and he probably died sometime in the 420s. We know very little about his life. He himself tells us that he traveled widely. His work certainly seems to reflect this. He spent some time, we don't know exactly how long, in Athens, but clearly he was there for part of his life, and he probably died in the Greek colony of Thurii in southern Italy. We also don't know when Herodotus began writing. His work was probably published sometime in the 420s BC, but we don't know the exact date when he finished his work and published it. His main topic was the Greco-Persian Wars of 490 and 480 through 479 BC. So he was writing about events that occurred some 60 years or so before the probable date of his publication. Herodotus does much, much more than simply recount the course of the Persian Wars of a couple of generations back. He sees the Greco-Persian conflict of 490 and 480 as part of a larger pattern of East-West conflict, or in Greek terms of European-Asian conflict, Asia referring to what we would call Asia Minor. And so he sets his account of the Persian Wars in the whole history of East-West conflict, stretching all the way back to the Trojan War as memorialized in the Homeric epics. And so, to set the background for his discussion of the Persian Wars, Herodotus describes several different ancient cultures and traces the courses of events many hundreds of years before his own day and before the subject matter that he wants to focus in on. Now, the Persian Wars, Herodotus' main subject, and for that matter, Herodotus is our main source on the Persian Wars. The Persian Wars were fought in 2 episodes, 10 years apart, as I mentioned very briefly in passing in the lecture on Aeschylus, who you'll remember fought at Marathon. The first Persian invasion of 490 BC under the Persian king Darius ended with the Athenians' victory at the Battle of Marathon, in which Aeschylus took part. The second Persian invasion of Greece, a much, much larger one, took place 10 years later when Darius' son Xerxes invaded Greece in 480. And this second Persian invasion of Greece ended with the united Greek forces' defeat of the Persians, final defeat of the Persians in 479 BC. Now, the defeat of the great Persian Empire by Greece was an absolutely astonishing event. If you look at a map, you can see how vast the Persian Empire was in 480 and how tiny Greece was. I like to say, and it's a bit of an exaggeration, but not all that much of one, that this is as though Luxembourg had defeated the Soviet Union. It was an absolutely astonishing thing. The Persians could not possibly have expected to be defeated by Greece. It was all the more astonishing because Greece was in no sense a unified country at this period. We talk about Greece as a kind of convenient shorthand, but actually at this time period, Greece was a conglomeration of independently governed, sometimes fiercely independently governed city-states. There was no country, no unified nation of Greece. There were Athens, Sparta, and all the other independent city-states. Athens played a crucial role in both Persian wars, both in the Battle of Marathon in 490 and in the Battle of Salamis in 480. And in fact, Athens' contribution to the victory over Persia led to Athens' growing hegemony, Athens' growing position of power in Greece during the 5th century BC. After the Persian defeat in 479, after the defeat of the Persians in 479, Athens formed a mutual defense league with various other Greek city-states that was called the Delian League. We know with hindsight that the Persians never came back, but in 479 it can't have been at all obvious that they wouldn't come back. And so understandably enough, Athens and various other city-states, particularly the island states between mainland Greece and the area of Persian dominance, formed a mutual defensive league called the Delian League. But as the 5th century progressed, the Delian League became more and more de facto an Athenian empire. As the Persian threat receded with the passage of time, Athens became in effect the head of an empire. The contributions that the other members of the Delian League had made to mutual defense became in effect tribute paid to Athens, and it was in some part the money from the Delian League that led to the great cultural flowering of Athens in the 5th century BC, the building of the Parthenon under the leader Pericles, for instance. These things were funded by money from the Delian League. So the Persian Wars led quite directly to Athens' position of political hegemony and to her cultural flowering in the 5th century. And that means we can see the Persian Wars both as the subject of Herodotus' work and as a necessary catalyst for his writing. If Athens had not been the intellectual and cultural center that it was in the 5th century, Herodotus probably would not have spent time there, probably wouldn't have written as he did. Also, by the time Herodotus came to write his histories, Athens was involved in another war, this time with another Greek city-state, Sparta. Athens and her allies on one side were at war with Sparta and her allies on the other side by the end of the 5th century. This was a Peloponnesian War of 431 through 404 BC, and we'll talk more about that in the next lecture when we turn to Thucydides, who wrote a history of that war. As I said already, we don't know the exact date that Herodotus published the histories, but scholars generally agree that he lived and wrote well into the 420s BC. And this is significant because the Peloponnesian War began in 431. So if Herodotus is writing in the 420s, that war is already well underway, and it's quite possible that at least one motivation for his writing was to try to remind the warring Athenians and Spartans of a time when they had worked together to repel a foreign invader, to try to remind them that there had been a time when these two city-states, far from being at war with one another, had stood shoulder to shoulder to defeat the Persians. Now, Herodotus' primary purpose, as he tells us in his opening sentence, which I'll turn to in some detail near the end of this lecture, was to record and explain the events of the Persian War. But to do that, he needed to explore the background of that war. Unlike Homer, who could begin in medias res, in the middle of the story, Homer could begin in the middle of the story, but Herodotus had to give a great deal of background. Homer could assume that his audience already knew the background story of the Trojan War. That's taken for granted. Homer doesn't tell us about the abduction of Helen by Paris. He doesn't fill us in on the background. He assumes we know that. He zeroes in on the anger of Achilles. Herodotus, however, has to give his readers information about the rise of the Persian Empire and, for that matter, the rise and political development of the most important Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta. He can take some amount of knowledge about Athens and Sparta for granted in his audience, but when it comes to the Persians, he has to give us a pretty full background recounting of how Persia came into its position of dominance. He can't assume that his audience already knows all that, as Homer could assume for his work. So Herodotus finds it necessary, in describing how the Persians came into their position of power, to first describe many of the other cultures that the Persians had encountered, other great empires that they had come in contact with and had conquered, in order to set up their position of power when they come face to face with Greece. And Herodotus's descriptions of other cultures, such as Egypt — he devotes one whole book of his work to a description of Egypt — are sometimes called digressions by modern scholars. Herodotus is supposedly full of digressions on Egypt, on Scythia, on other ancient cultures. But that is a modern critical term and not Herodotus's own. Herodotus referred to the various components of his work as logoi, the plural of logos, which among other things can mean narrative, account, or story. And there's no reason to think that he considered some of his logoi less relevant than others to his overall purpose. Some modern readers, working from modern standards of historiography, see the digressions as deviations from the overall narrative pattern, but Herodotus himself, I think, would probably disagree with that assessment. To explain Persia and the nature of its threat to Greece, he needed to examine other empires of the past and explain their encounters with the Persians, and examining the customs and governments of other cultures and their interactions with the Persians on the one hand and the Greeks on the other hand underlines the overall pattern of East-West conflict, which is the main focus of Herodotus's work. Because Herodotus attempted to trace the causes of the Persian Wars as far back as he possibly could, he includes in his narrative matters that modern historians would consider legendary or mythic, such as, for instance, the Trojan War, and many, many other things as well, talking about other cultures. He will include material that we would classify as legend or as myth. And this has sometimes been taken as evidence that Herodotus himself was naive or was incapable of evaluating his sources, didn't understand the difference between mythic events and actual events in his own time. I think this is an anachronistic assumption. I think it's anachronistic to expect Herodotus to make the same kind of distinction between myth and history that we do, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Herodotus was writing at a time when literacy was fairly new. And that means his primary source material had to be, generally speaking, oral tradition. He did use some written sources, we know that, we can tell that from his work, but most of his sources had to be oral tradition, orally recounted stories, because there was nothing else. There were no other sources for him to turn to. And he himself tells us that he depended heavily on information gathered orally. He often uses terms such as "it is said," or "people say," or "they, the group of people I was talking to, told me." Material preserved in oral tradition tends to be preserved in story form. That's how oral tradition works. You remember the great leaders, the great events of the past, by making them into interesting, easily memorizable, and memorable stories. In other words, oral tradition tends to work through narrative that we would be likely to classify as myth, or at least as legend. The question of whether Herodotus himself distinguished between myth and history as categories of explanation is still fiercely debated by scholars. As I said just a couple of moments ago, I think it's an anachronistic way of framing the question at all, but it is a question: did Herodotus distinguish between myth and history? That is still a matter of pretty fierce debate among Herodotean scholars. Part of the problem is that when Herodotus wrote, the Greek language had no word corresponding to either myth or history. There was no word for myth in Greek at this point. There was no word for history in Greek at this point. And so thus it seems quite clear that Herodotus doesn't make a terminological distinction. He can't distinguish terminologically if there are no terms to use. Along with most of his contemporaries also, Herodotus did not doubt that the famous characters of Greek tradition had really lived. We say that Agamemnon, Achilles, and the rest of the heroes of the Trojan War are mythical heroes. That is, we don't think they ever actually lived. Herodotus thought they had lived, but in this he was no more naive or confused than any other 5th century Greek. all the Greeks of the time assumed that these great heroes of the Trojan War had really lived in the remote past, in the 12th century BC. The details of their stories might be disputed, but their actual existence was taken for granted as a fact. So Herodotus doesn't seem to distinguish between myth and history as types of narrative. He wouldn't say, in these chapters where I'm talking about the Trojan War, I'm writing myth. In these later chapters where I'm talking about the Persian War, I'm writing history. But most scholars now agree, I think it's safe to say most now agree, that he does make a chronological distinction. And this is a point I want to stress because I think it shows us just how skillful and careful a thinker he was. He does make a chronological distinction between the remote past and the recent past, between what we would call the mythic time frame and what we would call the modern time frame. He makes a distinction between the remote past and the recent past, not in terms of type of narrative, but in terms of verifiability. And let me explain what I mean by that. Herodotus certainly does not exclude the remote past from his account. For instance, when he discusses the beginnings of the enmity between Europeans and Asians, between Westerners and Easterners, he refers all the way back to the stories of the Trojan War. Naturally enough, from his viewpoint, that's when East-West conflict began. But he clearly delineates the boundaries of his main subject, very near the opening of his work, by saying that he will start his narrative proper, that he will really get into the meat of his narrative with the man whom, as he puts it, I myself know to have been the first foreigner to wrong the Greeks. Now, in this phrase, when he says, I'm going to talk about the man whom I myself know was the first foreigner to wrong the Greeks, he makes it very clear that he's talking about Croesus, a king of Lydia, another area in modern-day Turkey, who ruled from around 560 to 546 BC. Now, that means, if you think about the dates, if Herodotus is writing in the 420s, and Croesus ruled from around 560 to 546. Herodotus is writing about someone who lived and ruled about 140 years, if we take the 560 date, before Herodotus' own time. This is right at the outer limits of the time period that scholars of oral tradition call three-generation reachback. What's meant by three-generation reachback is that the historian, the recorder of oral history, can talk to someone who talked to someone who was an eyewitness. Let me very quickly give you a personal example of how that works. In the summer of 2001, I attended a conference on World War I and its impact on the 20th century in Northampton, England. The keynote speaker of that conference in 2001 was a British veteran of the Western Front. And so I knelt at the feet of, held the hand, and talked to a man who had fought in France in 1917. If we fast forward to the 2040s, when I will be in my 80s, and imagine some young historian talking to me, that person in 2040 will be talking to someone who talked to someone who fought in World War I. That's three-generation reachback. And about as far as you can push it is exactly as far as Herodotus does push it, about 140 years. That, I think, is what he means by saying Croesus is the first man of whom he knows who wronged the Greeks. So Herodotus pretty clearly, I think, distinguishes between accounts set in verifiable time, accounts set in time, a time period where you can talk to someone who talked to someone who was there, and accounts that are further back than that are beyond the reach of that kind of three-generation memory. Organizationally speaking, Herodotus' histories consist of 9 books. Despite the vast amount of material contained in the text, its organization moves clearly towards its culmination in the account of Greece's victory over Persia. The first 3 books, the first 3 papyrus rolls of this 9-book set the context by recounting the ancient roots of East-West conflict and tracing the rise of Persia. Book 1 outlines the beginnings of the conflict between East and West, from the Trojan War to the subjugation of Ionia, that's a western region of Turkey, by Croesus, the first whom Herodotus knows to have wronged the Greeks, and the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus. Book 2 focuses on Egypt, which Cyrus's son Cambyses added to the Persian Empire, and Book 3 concentrates on the accession and rule of Cambyses' successor Darius. The next 3 books examine the campaigns of Darius, first against other cultures, then against the Athenians in 490. Book 4 looks at Darius's campaigns against Scythia and Libya. Book 5 describes the revolt of the Greek-speaking Ionian city-states from Persian rule in the 490s. Athens helped the Ionian revolt. That was what caused Darius's enmity against Athens. Those of you who have read Herodotus will remember that he tells us Darius had a slave stand behind him and whisper in his ear at dinner, "Sire, remember the Athenians," to keep his desire for vengeance alive. Book 6 begins the narrative of the Persian Wars themselves by describing Darius's invasion of Greece and his troops' defeat at the Battle of Marathon. And then in books 7 through 9, the histories culminate in the description of the second Persian invasion of Greece under Xerxes, Darius's son. Book 7 describes Xerxes' preparations and journey to Greece and includes the narrative of the Battle of Thermopylae, that extremely famous last stand of the 300 Spartan warriors in the narrow pass, trying to hold off the whole many thousand strong Persian army from getting into Greece, the Battle of Thermopylae, which was a defeat for the Spartans, but one of those glorious defeats that is in some ways more memorable than most victories. Book 8 culminates in the account of the crucial naval battle of Salamis, and Book 9 concludes the histories by describing the Persians' eventual defeat at the battles of Plataea and Mycale. And so the overall pattern of the histories is clear, a narrowing down from a broad, really in Herodotus' view, worldwide picture of great empires and their conflicts with one another, down to the Persian Empire and its rise under Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius, down to the invasion of Greece, finally onto Xerxes' second invasion of Greece and the details of the battles that were fought in that war. So Herodotus works from a broad overall portrait of foreign cultures and the remote past into a detailed and vivid description of the Persian Wars. It's really quite beautifully organized. Herodotus's achievement, both in arriving at the idea of his work and in bringing it to fruition, is absolutely astonishing. I just described the organization and said it's a beautiful achievement. It's also one that we cannot comprehend how he managed. How did he take notes? He didn't have a laptop. He didn't even have index cards and a ballpoint pen. How did he organize this material in his mind? How did he remember it? How did he write it using papyrus and ancient writing materials? We don't know. We know that he did because we have it, but the accomplishment is an absolutely astonishing one. In his opening sentence, Herodotus tells us his motivations. This sentence gives us insight into his motivations and his achievement, and the opening sentence of the work also delineates how Herodotus's writing differed really from anything that had preceded it. And I want to turn now to looking in some detail at the opening sentence of Herodotus's work. In Aubry de Selincourt's translation, the sentence reads, "Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry, so that human achievements may not become forgotten in time, and great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially to show why the two peoples fought with one another." Now, almost every word of that sentence repays careful consideration, and I could go on and on about every single word of it, but in the time I have left in this lecture, I can only look at the absolute key points of this sentence. The first word to note is actually the third word of the Greek sentence, historiae. The Greek reads, of Herodotus, of Halicarnassus, of the historiae, display this is, more or less. Historiae is clearly the word from which we get history, but in Herodotus's usage, in the Greek of his day, it means inquiry or research, and that's how de Selincourt translates it. Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry. Herodotus says that he is setting out, he's setting forth, he's displaying his historiae, his inquiry or his research, telling his audience, in other words, what he found out by inquiry. I went around asking people things, and this is what they told me. Because Herodotus' work was a new kind of writing, nobody had done exactly this before, there was no genre term for it. Nobody could say Herodotus just wrote a new, there wasn't a word for it. His work was so important and was so influential that the word he chooses here that means inquiry or research came very quickly to mean history in our sense. This is the display of the history of Herodotus. Some modern translators will translate it that way. It's very tempting to do so. It's also very misleading because Herodotus does not say, I'm writing history. There was no word for that. He gives us both the genre and the word to describe it. The second bit I want to concentrate on is human achievements. Herodotus here displays his inquiry so that human achievements may not become forgotten in time. Human achievements translates the Greek phrase tagenomena ex anthropon, which literally means the things that have come about from human beings. That's a literal, though awkward, translation. The things that have come about from or because of human beings. This is an important delineation of Herodotus' subject matter. He's interested in what humans do and what humans accomplish. Human achievement, not divine achievement, not the divine will, but what humans do. And his main concern is to keep these things that have come about from human beings from growing faded through the passage of time. The word that Selincourt translates as forgotten literally means faded. It's a word that's used about paintings, so that these deeds will not lose their brightness, will not become less vivid through the passage of time. The next phrase narrows tagenomena down by specifying that Herodotus is concerned with erga megala to kaithomasta, great and astonishing erga. Now the word erga can mean both works and deeds. So Herodotus here is allowing himself room to talk about great monuments, the pyramids of Egypt, the walls of Babylon, as well as great human deeds, the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. So again, the things that have come about from human beings include both the monuments we leave behind us and the deeds that we accomplish. And he says that he wants to recount the deeds and achievements of both Greeks and foreigners. Selincourt translates the Greek word barbaroi as barbarians. That is very, very tempting. Again, it's obviously where our word barbarian comes from, but in Herodotus' usage, it simply means foreigner. In fact, it means non-Greek speaker. It's originally an onomatopoeic word, believe it or not. A barbaros is someone who says bar, 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 bar instead of speaking Greek. It's like our word babble. So it originally means babblers, non-Greek speakers, foreigners. Herodotus is by no means trying to claim that the great Persian Empire consists of barbarians in the sense of savages. He's not saying that at all. He's saying foreigners. And his purpose in recording these human achievements is to prevent them from becoming akleia, without glory. Think back to the lecture I gave you on the Iliad, how the Homeric warrior fights for kleos, eternal glory, imperishable fame. Herodotus here says, I want to keep these achievements of human beings from losing their kleos, from becoming akleia. Herodotus is thus, if you think about it, claiming for himself a commemorative function similar to Homer's, which is a rather, cheeky thing to do. To say, here I am, I'm providing for the Persian Wars the same kind of memorialization that Homer provided in epic. Now, up to this point, Herodotus has presented two reasons for setting out his inquiry: to keep noteworthy events from being forgotten and to keep human achievements from losing their glory. We could say up to this point, he hasn't done anything so very new. This is what Homer did: memorialize achievements, preserve the kleos of those who accomplished great deeds. But the last clause of the sentence is in some ways the most important of all. Here Herodotus says that he wants to record through what cause, and the Greek word is itia, the two sides, Greeks and foreigners, warred with one another. This is the point, I think, at which Herodotus truly breaks new ground in his stated desire not simply to list events, but to explain the reasons for the conflicts between Greeks and Persians. Now, Homeric epic had definitely given reasons for individual human actions, but the wider sweeping causes were attributed to the gods. The opening lines of the Iliad cite the boule dios, the will of Zeus. The germ of true historiography lies in Herodotus' stated attempt and intention, however imperfect his achievement might be, to explain rationally and through argumentation why things happened as and when they did in human terms. Like any pioneer, he doesn't manage to create a new discipline full-fledged and self-consistent out of thin air. He owed a great deal to previous modes of thinking and of literature, and in particular to Homer. He does by no means exclude the gods entirely. He will list what he thinks the gods wanted as causes for events. But the gods are not characters in Herodotus' work, unlike in Homer, or for that matter in the Hebrew scriptures. Instead, he focuses on human actions and human responsibility. When he cites a god or the divine as a cause of an event, he also includes a human cause as well, almost always. So clearly, though Herodotus may not have been a fully fledged historian with all the critical resources of the modern historian at his beck and call, his approach to narrating the past provided a crucial foundation on which later historians could build their discipline. And in the next lecture, we'll look at Herodotus' first great successor, Thucydides.